I have the feeling that the best way to behave toward others, on the contrary, to try to have a minimum of power over them, to leave them as much freedom as possible to build their own happiness. Hello. My presentation name is Taking the Side of the Herbivore. This presentation is a shorter version of a presentation 4 times longer, which I gave at the Summers University of Animal Liberation in France in 2021. Don't hesitate to ask me questions afterward if you want to clarify any point. Here is how I went from fervent interventionism to I don't know anything anymore. When I found out about the interventionist anti-predation idea, I was immediately enthusiastic. I immediately saw that we absolutely had to do something about the problem caused by predation. And when I could see that most of the proposed solutions were a bit shaky, I want to believe that a solution could be found, and I read a lot about this. When I learned that Estevarius has written a book against interventionism, I absolutely want to read her arguments. And until then, all the arguments I received against anti-predation were extremely simple and could be summarized into acts. 1, they blamed us for not having all the solutions. And 2, they argue that predation wasn't an ethical problem that humans should address. I will argue against this point, as I argued again back when I was an interventionist. Then I will summarize Estevarius' works, adding a few arguments. Finally, if I have time, I will open the subject with a critical comparison to zoopolice. Part 1. Should we let animals suffer alone? They are an unspoken naturalistic ideology. We seek to pretend that all the negative things in the world come from human or more from nature, while everything else, animal, plants, and weather, are inherently good and innocent. But nature is not good by itself. Life in the wild is a source of much suffering. Hunger, disease, natural disasters. Those things we consider bad for us and protect ourselves from are also bad for animals. And like us, they are trying to protect themselves from those. It's such a commonplace, but I feel that it's something needs reminding, and I don't think it is self-evident that animals should be left alone to face the deadly dangers of natural weather element, disease, or predation. Something I find interesting, it is not up to me to resolve the ethical question of whether we should or shouldn't help suffering wild animals. It is a choice that most of us have already made of our own, individually. Most people want to help a wild animal when they see it suffering. Humans all over the world recover injured birds and feed stray cats. And they do this without resorting to any anti-speciesist theory of equality. They do it because they think it's right and their empathy tells them to. But when we address the issue of predation, we are often told that this suffering is none of our business, that we have no moral obligation to pay attention to the suffering of animals. I honestly believe this is always a slippery slope to say that some suffering is none of our business. It's the excuse that is always being used to let the weak be mistreated by the strong. I would like to focus your attention on something. If I haven't shown you any pictures of predation, it's because you don't want to see them. You have already seen them, and you know it's true. Seeing one animal kill another is a painful experience. What we feel at this exact moment is empathy for the victim. It seems to me that we should never silence our empathy on purpose empathy on the pretext that we see is normal, natural, or necessary. In my opinion, the question is, has anyone asked us anything? And as a matter of fact, most animals in pain do ask for help, especially in the case of predation. An attacked animal struggles, flees, and screams, exactly as a human would do in the same situation. There are obvious signs of suffering and cry for help. And because they are not addressed to anyone in particular, they are addressed to everyone, including us, because they just want to die. Just like the wooden bed, we spontaneously help. If we accept this conclusion, which is a simple responsibility to help whoever needs it, whenever you can, then we realize that wildlife is full of suffering. But most of the world's sentient individuals, especially small prey animals, give birth to many younglings, of which only a tiny fraction survives. Those who don't will die in their first day or minute, something quickly, but something horribly, having nothing but suffering. Suffering and death are integral part of the functioning of ecosystem, and you can't separate one from the other. You can claim that the ecosystem itself has a higher values than the sentient being within, but it's hypocritical. There is no situation where a human has applied this ideology to himself or his family. We always put our survival before the protection of the ecosystem. And I'm not saying that humans are fundamentally selfish. I don't think so. But if it's a choice between cutting a tree and starving to death, humans always choose to cut a tree. And so, the claim to the protection of nature and an ecosystem is more important in itself than a sentient being is very hypocritical, because what is left inside is always, except for me, of course. Since life in the wild is so difficult, some philosophers are asking whether this life are worth living for individual or as a group. The question is it worthwhile for a given species, like rabbit, to live in the wild, knowing that the most individuals will die horribly in their first 3 days, and those who live the longest will spend their entire life afraid of dying horribly, until finally probably dying horribly? Again, it's not for me to answer this question, but hear what I say. On a daily basis, as vegan, we act after we believe that the life of suffering is not worth living. That's why we campaign for the closure of slaughterhouse and livestock farm. We know that by stopping eating meat, we are setting the stage for those billions of future farm animals not only not to die, but never to exist. If we collectively thought that a life of suffering was better than no living, we will continue to eat meat. Yet, we have stopped. Regardless of what I think, what I want to see, you to see is that vegetarians already act if as a life of suffering isn't worth living. So, why should it be any different for wild animals, especially those who most the individual die a painful death just after birth? Spontaneously, we want to answer, nobody causes this painful death. Animal exploitation is particularly cruel because this is a voluntary act. But still, we have the duty of stop a suffer we don't cause. In most animal ethics, letting something bad happen is not as bad doing it. But it's never morally neutral to let something bad happen. And here again, I'm not going to argue this idea. I'm going to argue that you're acting if you already agree with me. After realizing the exploitation of animals by humans, after 3 months of essentially changing our own way of life, we have all come to the same conclusion here. Not participating isn't enough. We have a responsibility to stop the exploitation. It's because you think it is your duty to put end on suffering, even if you're no longer guilty, that you become an anti-speciesist activist. No, I will leave you to consider just how unmanageable this idea becomes as soon you involve non-human animal suffering because of other non-human animals. Yes, it's just way too big. But I don't think you can extricate yourself from an ethical issue just because this is difficult or impossible to resolve. Ethics don't work like that. If a problem is too big for us, we can admit that we are incapable of solving it. But wrongs doesn't become right. We are often told that the difference between the suffering caused by humans to animals and the suffering caused by the other animal to animals is that violence is necessary. Predator hunts because they need to feed, not out of preference or even cruelty. The argument we often give is this one. If you need a hair transfusion, you can demand that someone die to give their users. It's the same issue with predators, especially if they don't need to take one life to continue their harm, but one or more every day of their life. Does that make them bad people? Of course not. Do anyone suffer from it? Yes, that's obvious too. And we come back to the previous question. Why do we decide that one type of suffering counts less than another? Why do we consider the will to live of a toothed prey animal to be a less value than the will to live of one predator? And here again, if we relate for that, why has the whole history of human civilization consists in pushing predators as far away from city as possible by killing them? If we link the two ideas I have just outlined, it becomes clear that the body of prey don't belong to predator. They don't have a moral right or an opposite right to kill prey, even to survive. And that doesn't matter who is responsible for killing prey. Our individual responsibility is linked to the harm we are able to prevent, not just the harm we have caused. It is on the basis of the argument that pro-interventionists believe that we must help prey when we are able to do so, even if this means that a predator dies in a result of not being able to kill. This argument about predation convinces me, and to this day, I can't find any fault with it. I last up to this point. You could then argue that it would be less cruel to kill predators now than for them to starve. And honestly, I have to admit that this argument logically follows this previous one. But clearly, the consequences seems disturbing. Part 2. So, why not to go out and kill all the lions now? First, hunting. It is hard to ethically oppose the hunting of predator while being anti-predation. Killing predator today is the only way to deal with a question of who they will kill tomorrow. If we are intellectually honest, the only quick and effective solution is to kill the predator ourselves. It is not just a quick and efficient solution. It is also one of the few that doesn't require a collective consultation. There is no need for a global meeting of humanity free of speciesism to take the big decision to put an end to the suffering of the wide world. Of course, that could be better, a grand concentration, a democratic decision. But killing predator can be started on our own, legally. Everyone can do their part. As I said earlier, the conclusion is disturbing. Disturbing like, even if I understand the logic of nuclear dissuasion, I know that I would refuse to detonate an atomic bomb, and not just because of the direct consequence it may have, but because of the global consequence it may have if everyone else did it. So there you have it. The source of intuition. The reasoning is logical, but I'm not doing that. And yet should I? But no. Something is holding me back, and that something is that even though I can explain it, I feel it is wrong. Back to me. I have never killed a predator, not even a spider. I have regularly saved fly from my web or other prey from my cat, in the knowledge that I was probably depriving the spider of the food she needed. I was aware of the hypocrisy of my approach, but that it was not all. But I didn't kill the spider or the cat. And I regularly asked other anti-predation anti-speciesists around me, if hunting is necessary, why don't you kill spider too? I have never received an acceptable answer. They could not be summed up by is not in my temperament. That is really not a good enough explanation. You can argue in favor of murdering all the predators in the world, then conclude with let someone else to do it, I had the sight of blood. Especially since we all know what's happened when people want the benefit of killing animals without having to kill the animal themselves. They pay poor workers to do it, then feel superior to them, and create an ideology in which the dominant class are naturally more violent and need to be controlled. When academics write about we need to kill all predators for the common good, we know who is going to have to do it, and it won't be them. And this is disturbing too. This brings us to the problem caused by animal experimentation. Since nobody actually wants to go out and kill the predator, they are much more enthusiastic about another solution, and that is the solution of genetic engineering and the zooification of the world. Imagine a future in which the herd is entirely transformed like a zoo, in which predators are fed synthetic vegan meat every day, of a future in which carnivores have been genetically modified to become herbivores, and herbivore population are regulating using gentle method. The problem is this a far-off future. We are not even close to know how to do such a thing. It is a comfortable solution to our cognitive dissonance. It allows us to wish to change things, but also to leave the question hanging in the air. And let's be honest, it's also about leaving the job to someone else, because the particularity of the highly technological future is that it's a biology job, and this is far from being the most represented profession in the anti-species crowd. But let's pretend that all biologists are with us now. The idea involves either setting up artificial selection systems of all over the world or modifying the DNA of all living creatures in the ecosystem. These results are clearly not going to come easily. If this can be achieved, they will be achieved at the cost of enormous, potentially very painful and cruel research on individual animals of all species. I'm not going to explain here why I think animal experimentation is never acceptable. It is a long and complicated subject. But here is the thing. The zooified future involves testing on non-consenting animals, with the aim of possibly reducing the suffering of other animals in the future. There are other reasons for opposing this theoretical technological future. For the good of this presentation, let's assume that the entire ecosystem can be modified by a brand new research method without any pain at all. But there is one value very much absent from their reasoning, the agentivity of animals. What interventionists propose to do to prey on predators is to create a gilded cage in which they have been stripped of all possibility of choice. All freedom have been taken away, along with all risk of harming themselves. No more freedom to seek their own food, their own shelter, their own environment, their own reproductive strategy. This is what you want for yourself. Choice are intrinsic value. Freedom has an intrinsic value too, as most human ethic theory agree. What sense does it to try to maximize an individual well-being will pretend to design for them what their well-being is? And there is a third theory from removing suffering from the wild, which clearly is not the most popular, but it's not that rare either. I'm going to struggle to find positive terms to talk about it, so let's put it simply. Is it suppressing out all sentient life on Earth, except for human being? This brings up to the last major contradiction between the interventionist movement and the anti-species movement, since eradicating all forms of life on Earth is something that specialists in capitalist systems are already doing very well. If that is the goal, how do we explain that people concerned about the suffering of non-human animals are not massively advised to drive Hummer and eat the most polluting meat possible? Another point are the data that interventionism rely on. A significant number of interventionist authors argue that life in the wild contains far more suffering than happiness, and that the vast majority of wild animals have lives they are no worth living, exactly like those of farm animals. The logical consequence is that it will be better for all species, absolutely all species, not to exist. This may seem an extreme conclusion, but the scary thing is you don't have to pursue interventionism reasoning for very long to reach this conclusion. In fact, it's a gem of a way interventionism theory, and one we don't want to admit because it's scary. I was clearly one of these people. I rejected the idea that my ideology means killing all the animals in the world. I thought we find another solution, probably biology in the future, you know. I think this is one of the fundamental problems underlying the interventionist movement, a slightly overconfident and naive belief in the future progress of science. But can we prove that the life of wild animals suffering outweighs happiness? The truth is we don't know. It's impossible to obtain any real information on the overall value of the life of wild animals, because gathering such information will require resources that will be impossible to have. As for happiness, we know even less. It is easy to anthropomorphize suffering, but let's be honest. Who has a clear idea of what makes a spider happy to the point of being able to quantify? We can say that happiness is more important than unhappiness in nature, but we can say the opposite either. We will probably never know. Brian Tomasic, an interventionist author, has a direct response to this argument, in which he admits, indeed, that we are unable to obtain the correct estimate of suffering and happiness in wild animals. Even so, he believes that all animals should be eliminated because he feels that the avoidance of unhappiness is more important to the pursuit of happiness. To put it simply, in his brand of utilitarianism, 1 point of happiness is not equal to 1 point of unhappiness. So, interventionists want to take a vital decision for all sentient beings in the world based on an impossible measure of suffering and happiness made on an unknown number of individuals and species, judged wholly in the light of a very specific ideology, which consists in considering that an equal amount of suffering is more important in ethical terms than an equal amount of happiness. Let's pause for a moment. Do I and only I consider 1 point of suffering to be equivalent to 1 point of happiness? After giving it a lot of thought, I still don't know. Do it depend on the day? The fact that I am unable to answer this question for myself make it clear that I am unable to proving the answer for all the individuals who make up the living, and no one could without extrapolating for their own subjectivity. It's not always so bad to make abusive extrapolation when you want to focus to a problem. But this extrapolation of the basic data to lead to the conclusion the life of wild animal is no worth living. And this conclusion will then be the basis for an action plan, which consists, at best, in genetic engineering all life on Earth, at worst, in destroying it entirely. I believe that this type of project should not be started without first answering that the predictive calculations are extremely accurate, which they are not at all. Let's turn now to the problem of the abuse of power. To take responsibility for the happiness of the entire biosphere is also to take all the power over the entire biosphere. I believe in the kindness and empathy of human beings, I really do. But to assume that humanity will ever be capable of such moral perfection that having total control over the entire biosphere, it will be used the power exclusively for altruistic and selfless purpose? No, I'm not that naive, and I can understand how interventionist others can be. I have the feeling that the best way to behave toward others, on the contrary, to try to have a minimum of power over them, to leave them as much freedom as possible to build their own happiness, to buy their own happiness. The interventionist project is exactly the opposite. It asserts that the best way to help other animals is to behave like an enlightened despot, to have control over absolutely everything, their environment and their DNA, and the way the world would be better. The question I ask myself is, what makes a person believe in the possibility of an enlightened dictatorship run entirely by altruism, when humanity, taken as group or individually, have never behaved with such pure altruism and high empathies on the world pure? The only answer I can see to the question is that they have a sense of their own moral superiority and believe that they, themselves, are able to ruling all the biosphere, of making decisions for the world world. And to put it simply, intuitively, people would think the world will be better if a small elite ruled the destiny of every animal and plant on Earth scare me a little. In the end, my argument don't oppose all forms of interventionism, but they do at least oppose a project to zoify the world. There are other interventionist initiatives that cannot be subject of such excess precisely because they are more moderate in scope. For example, wildlife centers that care for injured wild animals, or even individual initiatives such as feeding animals in winter and giving them shelter. We don't have to choose between changing the whole ecosystem and doing nothing, but we have a responsibility to discern where we are competent and we are not competent before we act. Here's my conclusion about interventionism and predation. The problem is real, the problem is huge. The system is huge. The population we are talking about is very huge too. And humanity is far from being a monolithic block speaking with one voice. We need to be very modest before organizing any large-scale action that will affect the whole sentient world. Thank you.